Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm Jonky.
And I'm Panay.
We're here to cut through some of the noise, really, and bring you what we think are the most critical insights from recent expert discussions, focusing today on global power.
That's right. Specifically, that really intricate and sometimes, let's be honest, tense relationship between the U.S. and China.
And Russia's role in all this, which is, well, surprisingly pivotal, it seems.
Definitely plays a key part.
So our mission for you in this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world, different lenses that experts are using.
Right. One lens really prioritizes security, national survival above everything else.
And the other?
The other focuses much more on global prosperity, on how interconnected we all are economically.
And it's just fascinating how these different starting points, these worldviews, really shape how people understand the biggest geopolitical questions we're facing.
Profoundly shapes them.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right in. The core tension, the place where you hear the most immediate, stark disagreement, is this question: is China actually a threat to the United States?
Mm-hmm. And it's definitely not a simple yes or no.
Not at all. And what's really striking is how experts looking at, seemingly the same set of facts can come to such fundamentally different conclusions.
Absolutely. When you sort of dive into these debates, you see these two main schools of thought emerge quite clearly.
Okay.
So on one side, you've got this perspective that's rooted in what's often called a realist international relations theory.
Realist. Okay.
For them, the absolute priority is national security. It's survival, really. They see the world as this, anarchic system.
Meaning no world government, no one in charge globally.
Exactly. No higher authority. So in that kind of world, states, nations, they have to look out for number one. They aim to be really powerful, sort of the biggest and baddest dude on the block, just to make sure they survive.
Okay, that's one view. What's the alternative?
The other perspective, and this often comes more from an economic angle, it tends to prioritize prosperity, shared prosperity. It sees the world less as a battlefield and more in positive some ways. The idea that cooperation and trade can actually benefit everyone involved. Doesn't have to be one winner and one loser.
Fascinating contrast. So let's dig into that realist view first. Can you elaborate a bit more on how they see the USChina dynamic specifically? It sounds pretty confrontational.
Oh, it absolutely is. From that realist standpoint, the United States is already what they call a regional hegemon. It dominates its neighborhood, the Western Hemisphere.
Right. No major rivals close by.
Precisely. And here's the key part of the argument. The U.S., from this perspective, does not tolerate peer competitors. It actively works to prevent another country from achieving similar dominance anywhere else on the planet.
And they see historical precedent for this.
They do. They argue the U.S. has played a key role in taking down potential rivals before. Think Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. These powers challenged the U.S. position and, as one analyst memorably put it, ended up on the scrap heap of history.
Wow. Okay, so how does China fit into that picture today?
Well, China's economic rise has been, spectacular. And the realists argue China's now translating that economic might directly into military might.
To do what?
To try and dominate Asia, to push the U.S. out beyond the first island chain, that's Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and maybe even beyond the second island chain further out in the Pacific.
So China trying to become its own regional hegemon.
Exactly. And from the U.S. realist perspective, that's just unacceptable. It's a direct challenge. And this leads inevitably, they say, to an intense security competition.
Across the board.
Across all domains, military, economic, and especially high-tech. So this view paints the U.S. as, frankly, a ruthless great power determined to stay number one. And that makes conflict with China seem, almost inevitable.
Inevitable. That's a heavy word. But you said there's this other way of looking at it, the more economic, maybe optimistic view. This is where it gets really interesting, right? Yeah. What's the counter-argument here?
It's a completely different world, almost. From this other perspective, often held by economists or those focused on global integration, China is simply not a threat.
Not a threat. How do they frame it then?
They see China primarily as a massive market.
Yeah.
A place with great food, great culture, wonderful people, a civilization vastly older than ours.
So the focus is on opportunity, not danger.
Precisely. The core argument is that any kind of conflict, whether a Cold War or, God forbid, a hot war with China, would be economically devastating for the U.S., absolutely catastrophic.
Especially for certain areas.
Yeah, think about California, for example. It's probably been the biggest beneficiary of China's rise, probably in the whole world, because of those deep economic connections, especially in tech.
Right.
So for people primarily concerned with, say, the tech industry or California's economy or just global peace and, the future, the argument is that being pro-China, or at least pro-engagement, makes sense.
They'd point to things like China joining the WTO.
Exactly. They'd say that move enriched all of you.
Yeah.
This country, the world. The fundamental belief here is that economics is not a zero-sum game.
One country's gain isn't necessarily another's loss.
Right. And they extend that logic, arguing that security doesn't have to be a zero-sum game either.
Yeah.
The idea is maybe we can just manage the relationship, stay a little bit away from each other strategically, avoid bumping into each other militarily, and let both economies continue to grow.
It really is incredible how you can have such polar opposite takes from serious experts looking at the same situation.
It is. It highlights how much assumptions and priorities shape analysis.
So, okay, we have these two big frames for China, existential threat versus economic partner. How does Russia fit into this picture? Because Russia often dominates headlines as, a major adversary.
Well, this is another area where the realist perspective offers a perhaps surprising take. From their viewpoint, Russia is actually not a serious threat to the United States.
Really? Not serious compared to China.
Exactly. They see Russia as the weakest of those three great powers, the U.S., China, and Russia. So if you're playing old-school balance of power politics, which is central to realism,
okay,
and if your main goal as the U.S. is to contain China, which the realists insist should be the primary goal, then strategically, well, you want Russia on your side of the ledger?
You want Russia helping you balance China, or at least not helping China.
Precisely. Or at minimum, you want them neutral. So this analysis leads them to conclude that current U.S. policy has actually pushed Russia into the arms of the Chinese.
Which they see as a mistake.
A remarkably foolish policy is how it's often described, because it unites two powers that maybe could have been kept apart or even played off against each other from a purely strategic standpoint.
And the current conflicts complicate this further.
Absolutely. Being bogged down in Ukraine and now with renewed attention on the Middle East, it makes it very difficult for us to pivot to Asia to deal with China, which, again, for realists, is the main event, the long-term challenge.
And the economic perspective on Russia, is it similar?
It's less focused on Russia as a strategic piece in the same way, but it implicitly agrees that Russia isn't the primary economic or even security concern compared to the U.S.-China dynamic. The emphasis there is more on just avoiding unnecessary conflict generally, avoiding actions that might, provoke World War III, as they might put it.
Right, avoiding massive destabilization.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the theory, the grand strategy. What does it all mean on the ground? Where are the actual physical places we should be worried about, the flashpoints?
Yeah, where the tension could actually spill over. Experts consistently point to 3 flashpoints in East Asia to keep your eye on.
Okay, what are they?
First, the South China Sea. It's described as a very dangerous place. Lots of overlapping claims, naval patrols. Things could escalate quickly there. We could end up in a war, for sure, is the sentiment you hear.
Okay, South China Sea. What else?
Second, the East China Sea. Similar issues, particularly around disputed islands between China and Japan, also tense.
And the third, Taiwan, presumably?
Taiwan, yes. Although, interestingly, some argue is not a serious problem at the moment or for the foreseeable future.
Really? Given all the headlines?
Yeah, the argument hinges on the existing agreements. The U.S. has 3 agreements with China, the joint communiques, that basically form the foundation of the One China policy. The idea is that as long as those are respected, direct conflict can be avoided, as it has been for decades. We've managed to stay out of that so far.
Interesting nuance there. And you mentioned China building up its military, its navy specifically. What's driving that?
Well, they're building a serious blue water navy, one with power projection capability, the ability to operate far from home. A key argument is that it's a direct reaction to perceived U.S. strategy. The U.S. has historically focused on controlling maritime choke points, like the Malacca Straits, which are vital for China's oil imports, and using the first island chain as a sort of containment barrier.
So China feels encircled.
Exactly. So in developing this power projection, China is, in a way, imitating the United States. They're building the capability to secure their own interests and break out of what they see as strategic containment.
It sounds like a classic security dilemma. Actions taken for defense are seen as offensive by the other side.
Precisely. And underlying all of this, the one thing both sides tend to agree on is the absolute horror, the paramount concern, the risk of a nuclear war.
Right.
Experts across the board really stress prudence, caution, avoiding unnecessary military proximity in these flashpoint zones. There's this stark reminder, one nuke can ruin your whole day.
A chilling thought, and definitely puts things in perspective. It really underscores the need for careful management, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Strategic distance, open communication, they become critical.
Okay, let's widen the lens slightly. Where does another major player, India, fit into this US-China dynamic? Are they just siding with the US?
India's role is, well, it's complicated. It's quite nuanced. On one hand, yes, you see India viewed as a key ally, especially within the framework of the Quad.
That's Australia, Japan, the US, and India, right? Often seen as balancing China.
Exactly, focusing on a free and open Indo-Pacific. But then you hear another perspective, arguing that India is its own rising superpower with its own very distinctive interests.
Meaning they won't just follow the US lead.
Right. The idea that India will just neatly align with the US against China is called another delusion by some analysts. They point out that India is quite smartly maintaining its good relations with Russia.
Why Russia?
Partly because, like the realists we discussed, many in India also see that the Russians are no great threat to India's core interests.
So for India, the main concern is China.
Yes. For India, the real threat is China. And there are two big areas of concern you hear about. First, that disputed India-China border up in the Himalayas. They've had actual clashes there, so it's a very real, tangible risk.
And the second?
The Indian Ocean. As China builds that blue water navy and gains power projection capability, it's increasingly active in the Indian Ocean, which India traditionally views as its strategic backyard. That's a growing point of friction.
So India is balancing its own complex set of relationships and threats.
Absolutely. And it kind of ties back to that core realist idea, doesn't it? Survival in an anarchic system. States try to get as powerful as possible, and if a state becomes dominant in its own region, like the U.S.,
with no local threats,
then maybe it feels free to expand its influence globally, maybe even roaming all over the planet, interfering in every country's business, as one theorist put it, to lock in that top position.
So let's try and wrap this up for you, our listeners. What we've really unpacked today is this fundamental split, this deep disagreement about whether China is truly a threat to the U.S.
Yeah, and it's not just political posturing. It stems from these really different worldviews. One prioritizing national security, survival, power politics.
And the other focused on prosperity, global trade, interconnectedness, maybe seeing cooperation as possible, even necessary.
Exactly. And it's not really about saying one view is definitively right and the other is wrong.
No, it's more about understanding these powerful, sometimes conflicting forces and ideas that are actively shaping the world we live in right now.
Mm-hmm. And maybe here's a final thought, something to chew on. We talked about the argument that the U.S. can, roam the planet partly because it's so secure in its own hemisphere, a true regional hegemon.
Right, no major threats nearby frees it up to act globally.
So the question this raises is, if China were to achieve that same kind of undisputed regional dominance in Asia, would it then inevitably start behaving more like the U.S. has, expanding its influence globally?
And what would that mean for this whole cycle of great power competition? Would it just continue, maybe with different players in the lead roles?
It's a big question with no easy answers. Something to think about.
Definitely a lot to think about. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into some really complex layers of global power dynamics.
Our pleasure.
If you found this discussion insightful, and we hope you did, please do take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Geopolitics Gazette for more deep dives like this one. Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring. Thanks for listening.